afternoon, everybody. Please come in and take your seats. We're about to commence the final plenary session for this first day of our conference. My name is Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this final session. I also want to acknowledge that the session's taking place on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. We're very fortunate to have had a sponsor for this particular session, and I'd like to invite Nicola Lemon, who's standing next to me here, who is the Partner National Social and Affordable Housing Lead from KPMG. Thank you for sponsoring this event. I invite you to say a few words.
Hello, I would like to just say that KPMG is a proud sponsor of this session and has been invested in sponsoring this event. This is now the third year running. At KPMG, as you've heard, my role is as the National Social Affordable Housing Lead, and at KPMG we've developed a National Social Affordable and Disability Housing Strategy that means that we really see ourselves seriously involved in the purpose of being part of the housing ecosystem, lending our credentials and our learnings from working with state government, local government, federal government and community housing providers and private developers. We've been working across that ecosystem to enable partnerships and with our purpose of improving availability and affordability of housing, like the majority of you in this room. We're excited to sponsor this particular panel. I know there's going to be some interesting debate about New South Wales planners being responsible for the housing crisis across the Anglosphere. I've stolen your thunder, Tim. Just before this event, we ran a quick LinkedIn poll, which I thought may be of interest, asking, was supply the silver bullet? The responses were 14% said we needed to support smart housing design, 21% said speed up planning, 22% said subsidise housing access, and actually 43% said boost construction feasibility. So it will be interesting to see what's said today. Thank you for listening to me, and again, our delight to sponsor this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And I just need to thank a few others before we kick off formally for this session. I want to thank the State Government of Western Australia, as well as the business events supporter, Business Events Perth, and industry partner, Perth Convention and Exhibition Centre, for their support of this conference, as well as KPMG for their support of this particular session. Well, I'm going to hand over now to Natasha Mitchell from the ABC, who's going to be leading this very interesting and very timely conversation about supply. Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you. Let's give it up for the whole conference team, shall we? Yep, my name is Natasha Mitchell and I present Big Ideas on ABC Radio National. Who's familiar with the show? Oh, that's good. That's what I like to see. So we're a program that features big thinkers at live events all over Australia, but also internationally. We go to air weeknights and also at midday, so you can wash the dishes to us and also eat your lunch with us, but we're also on the ABC Listen app as well. So I'm very pleased that we are recording today's event so we can get some of these themes across to the national ABC audience. I want to acknowledge and thank the AHURI team for having us, for inviting us to be part of the conference today, and also to join you on Whadjuk Noongar country. And, you know, I like to think then that Whadjuk Noongar peoples are communities that have sheltered together safely millennia before this moment, and one person's shelter needs have always been everybody's shelter needs. And we are looking forward to involving you in today's conversation as well. So we'll have a roving mic, there'll be questions, The wonderful volunteers here in the red T-shirts will come to you and, let it rip. We'd love to get your input. So as you know, under the Housing Accord, the National Cabinet committed to a target of building 1.2 million new so-called well-located homes, dwellings by 2029. All states and territories have signed on. And the question for this session is a hot potato. Is supply the silver bullet that we need to fix the nation's housing crisis? Increasing supply is certainly the headline policy of the nation's governments right now. It's at the heart of the Productivity Commission's recent report on the construction industry. People are certainly crying out with much urgency for access to more housing. In the session on gender inclusivity just before, if some of you were there, one of the panellists talked about someone who is currently living in their car and receiving chemotherapy while she's living in her car. So this is an urgent issue. But the question we want to consider is, will increasing supply improve the crisis of housing affordability? Will it improve housing accessibility? Will it improve housing security, housing quality? How do we measure success as we attempt to increase supply in this nation? And what do we actually mean when we talk about supply? What kind of housing and where? And then another question we might consider is, has the focus on housing become the politically palatable policy response to the housing crisis in this country at the expense of other important policy levers? So we have a fantastic panel. Let me introduce you to them. Many of you will know our speakers today. David Reynolds, right here, is Chief Executive of the new combined, it's a bit of a super department of housing and urban development in South Australia, and in that role he's focused on the rapid construction of additional homes as well as the state's planning system, amongst other things, and he brings to that role his experiences as head of the Department of Treasury and Finance for many years and also former head of the Department for Trade and Investment, amongst other roles. Thanks for being here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
You can clap, why not?
That is unusual for a public servant.
It's all right. We've got Professor Rachel ViforJ, is John Curtin Distinguished Professor of Economics at Curtin University. Rachel leads research on housing policy, housing affordability, intergenerational housing issues, the links between housing and wellbeing, the economic impacts of housing, and she serves in multiple capacities in multiple ways. She's a member of the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. And the CEDA Council on Economic Policy, amongst other roles. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, Natasha. Really happy to be here.
Great to have you. And we've got Tim Williams, Dr. Tim Williams, in fact. He's Global Practice Leader of Cities for the architecture firm Grimshaw. Some of you might listen to the Grimshaw Cities podcast, which he hosts. It's an excellent listen. He was Arup's Head of City in Australasia. He was CEO of the Committee for Sydney. He's been an advisor for the Greater Sydney Commission on major infrastructure projects, and he also happened to advise 5 housing ministers in the UK and the Blair Brown government, playing a key role in the emergence of Homes England, I should say, a public agency funding new affordable housing. And I just want to acknowledge that Dr. Angela Jackson, we'll give it up for Tim.
Sorry.
And Dr. Angela Jackson from the Productivity Commission was going to be here, but unfortunately couldn't be here in person. So we just wanted to acknowledge that. Let's kick off. Okay, our topic, housing supply. Is it the silver bullet? I just want a quick headline response from you as to whether you think it is a silver bullet. Tim.
I'm disappointed you asked for a quick reply. Because I wanted to do a warm welcome to loads of good things that were going on and then say no.
A quick reply, and then we'll drill in.
Well, the government's housing target, even its own modelling says, will not affect the affordability once the 1.2 million are achieved, which they won't be achieved. And they've just announced changes to the first-time buyers incentives which will actually raise house prices. So the answer is it's got nothing to do with a real impact on affordability. It's an entirely performative discussion about affordability. We need to do other things, which I hope we all talk about. There's a dialogue of the deaf going on at the moment between two-thirds of the room here know that housing supply is necessary but not sufficient to solve the housing crisis. But housing lobbyists, I think, have captured the attention around the supply discussion, and we're not even delivering the supply, right? So the numbers already are less than 2019, despite all the palaver and all the government support for the private sector. We have a private sector crisis on our hands, not a public sector crisis on our hands. People are ignoring it.
What do you mean by the dialogue of death?
The dialogue of the deaf is because common sense view, I understand it. You build, normally in a business, if you throw more things into the market, the price goes down. That's not true with housing. It's not as simple as that with housing for reasons that we will discuss. But people talk as though it is, right? And secondly, they talk as though once we've achieved this magical number of housing, that in some unstated amount, it will drop. Nobody ever says what they mean by affordability. Nobody, for example, do we mean the level of affordability was in Australia in the 1980s when 4 times your salary could buy a home? Do we mean that? Do we mean that twice as many people today, for example, can't afford a home under 35? Do we mean by affordable to restore affordability to 35-year-olds? I don't think we have a genuine or honest discussion about what we mean. And secondly, we confuse it with affordable housing, which we need more of, and definitely need more supply of, but it's not the same. And the two they're not really that closely connected, actually. We need more affordable housing. What the government is doing is not going to deliver housing affordability.
Lots to unpack there. Right. Rachel, what about you? Is housing supply the silver bullet?
Well, Natasha, I think crises rarely have a simple solution. And,
Funny that.
Yeah, housing is no different. So I think we are in a situation where we have a housing crisis. It's taken a while to get here, and it could not have happened because of one single factor. And therefore, there is no one single solution. So I think my headline answer is basically no. Supply is not a silver bullet. In fact, nothing is a silver bullet. I think what we need is a package of solutions. I'll just make some really quick points. I think the real question here should be about how do we make housing more affordable rather than just how do we increase supply? Because there are other factors at play. Supply is kind of half the problem if you want to look at it in an economic framework, because the other half is demand, which is how much of housing do people want. So that goes into the more thornier aspects of the debates around population planning, tax reform that I think that are politically difficult. But yet I think these are things that we need to talk about bravely and emotionally, because we can't just be looking at half the problem. If we just want to look at half the problem, which is supply, then we'll only be at most, developing ideas around half the solution. So I think that's a big issue there. Another point that I would like to make, I think, which is really important, is that when we talk about supply, we tend to say supply, but what we really mean is new supply. And when you think about it, when you look at the total housing stock in Australia, 98% of our housing stock already exists. So these are established dwellings. So when we have new supply come onto the market, that's adding about 2% to the housing stock every year. Now that's important, yes it is of course, but there's another 98% that we don't think enough about how we can better utilize the existing housing stock. I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, let's just come back to briefly that point. How would you see us better utilising existing housing stock in this conversation about supply? Yeah,
well, you see, it's the level of housing supply that affects prices. So when we increase new supply, that's really great. It's adding to the housing stock, but it's usually not adding enough or quickly enough to actually affect supply, so to affect prices. So you really have to look at the other 90%. One simple example is that there's often discussions around a mismatch in between the size of the household that's living in a dwelling and the size of the dwelling. But then if we've got a mismatch, for instance, we have small, maybe a single individual living in a 4-bedroom house, or we have, on the other hand, a growing family living in an overcrowded situation, then there's a mismatch between household need and the dwelling that's available. But we can actually make it easier for people to kind of shift into houses in locations that they would prefer to if we were willing to deal with things that hinder the effective exchange of houses between individuals and households. And of course, one of those areas is, if you look at stamp duty, for instance, it is a barrier to home purchase, but it is also a barrier to people who want to downsize. It's a barrier to people who want to upsize. So that's an issue that's at play. And again, that plays into the area of tax reform, of course, and which, when you talk about tax, there's always winners and there's losers. So that's where it becomes difficult. But one of the ways in which we can better utilize our housing stock is to look at transaction costs that are preventing people from moving.
So your concern is that we're centering the supply conversation at the expense of not discussing other important policy levers?
I think there's certainly that at play.
David Reynolds from South Australia. So do you think that supply is a silver bullet? You're in charge of a department that is responsible for fast-tracking supply in your state. There's been an identified problem of supply. It's taken many decades to build. Silver bullet or not?
Silver bullets are always an interesting question, and as my colleagues have said, it's a complex issue, but supply is part of the answer. I mean, it's easy to talk about other issues, and we'll get into those, but supply has to be part of the answer to this question. We're not going to get anywhere forward without building more houses, and I don't think any of us disagree with that. You're right, 2% per year is what we add to our housing stock, so over 5 years, we're adding 10% more houses in this country. And I think that is an important part of making sure we're taking actions we need to. Of course, it's not the only action, and that's the important part of this conversation. It's what are we building and what are we trying to achieve as we build those houses to make sure we've got diversity of housing and we make sure we're building different housing types for different people who need different outcomes. And that's what we're really trying to focus on. So I actually think housing is much more of I'm inclined to the yes part of this rather than the no in terms of the silver bullet, because we know it is a big part of the answer. We have to have more houses. You know, if we had twice as many houses, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So
paint the picture in South Australia, the challenge that you have ahead of you. What's led you to this point? How significant is the supply situation in South Australia?
So I think our supply challenge is pretty much the same as everyone else's, so we don't have a difference in that. We've all kind of got here over a long period of time. In our case, quite a bit of underinvestment in infrastructure, and that is water and wastewater systems to make sure that we've got land that is developable. You know, in South Australia, we don't have a problem of not enough land. We have land that we can build houses on, but it's not in a developable state. So what we've really been focusing on is making sure we can get water, wastewater, roads, stormwater infrastructure right.
Well, you've got that pretty much all in your portfolio.
I do, which is
when do you get time to sleep?
Rarely, which is important. So, you know, but these are things which
SA Water is now in your portfolio alongside housing, alongside urban development.
Yes, that's correct. So we've got all of these things which, for the first time, and this is a first thing in the country, no one's done this, we've brought them all together, and it means we are having these conversations much better. And that has worked very effectively. I must say it's worked even better than I thought it would, to make sure we're actually having the right conversations, because it's amazing how disjointed bureaucracies can become. You know, we've all talked about silos in government. They're fairly easy to find, and the way through them is always communication. And we've created those communication channels, which means we are now focused on getting the infrastructure in the right places so we can get houses more quickly.
What are you doing differently?
It's really the planning to bring them all together. So if we talk about our water authority, developers would talk to them about where they wanted infrastructure, and they wouldn't really have a great link to the rest of government and where our planning agency is thinking that houses are going. So if we'd had the conversation with our water authority where they thought houses were going, our planning authority where they thought developments were going to be, they'd have different answers. And that was really challenging. And since we worked that out, we start bringing these conversations together, we realised that we can actually then put our efforts into maximising the outcomes. You know, because we recognise we're in a housing crisis, we need to act like we're in this crisis to move more quickly, and actually making sure we just take steps forward. One of the challenges I have with this kind of debate is there are multiple issues, there are complex issues, and we always get stuck into this question of, do we try and solve every issue? Or do we get on and just start trying to solve some things that are in front of us, and then seek to add on additional solutions as we go?
Okay, but one of the concerns, and let's expand this out now, but one of the concerns is, okay, it's been raised, will increasing supply guarantee a reduction in house prices? Can you make houses more affordable as you increase supply?
Well, nothing's ever a guarantee, but I can tell you if you don't build more houses, you won't get more affordable house pricing. So one thing you can do is build more houses. So I actually think it does make a difference. You know, you actually need to build this. We're not going to get a reduction in affordability. Affordability is a very challenging issue in this country, but you're not going to get there without building more houses. So it is actually a part of this story. But I think it's important that we say, what are we building? And I think, you know, affordable product is different for everybody. It depends what you need, and who you are, and the circumstances you're in. So diversity of that additional house supply is much more important. We can't just keep building quarter-acre blocks or townhouses until we run to the horizon. We've got to actually think about what we build so we can build different products which can be affordable to different markets.
Tim Williams, the Grattan Institute reports that we have the least housing stock per person in the developed world, so 400 dwellings per 1,000 in the OECD, 1,000 people. And Australia is one of just 4 OECD countries to have gone backwards over the last 20 years.
They can't count. It's.
You push back on this. You think we're not doing too badly on the supply side?
I was amazed when I read not just the Grattan report. Look, there's part of the dialogue of the deaf, and a lot of people here will understand this, is that people think development is a conventional business, right? And there's no joke about what makes it. One of the things that makes it different. Somebody said, buy land, they've stopped making it, right? So there are differences in the whole business of development. Number two, they seem not to understand some of the figures. So when Jim Chalmers, again, I was astonished, in the Treasury papers, justifying the excellent investment that I welcome, that the federal government made into housing, said that Australia had one of the poorest performances of housing delivery. Well, here's a couple of numbers for you to put it in context. So Australia wants to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years. Why does Britain only want to build 1.5 million homes over 5 years? I.e., that suggests that we're 2.5 times more efficient than the British at building homes, given we've got a population of 27 million, they've got a population of 69 million. I.e., that doesn't add up to me. Britain is a low performer. Australia is a high performer by international standards. Part of the problem with Australia, though, and its challenge, is that its population is growing faster than most other countries. So it has to run to stay almost where it is. Can I go back to the 98 to 2%? That's really important for listeners to understand this. You know, this is part of what makes housing difficult to even as if you deliver, you know, X amount more, why it will not have that much effect on prices. Because the market that you're in already is massively bigger than the 2%. So the house prices are set by the 98% that already exist. You might imagine that if we were producing 10 or 15% extra a home a year, the house prices might go down. But guess what the development sector would do at that point? They would stop building. Because this is the thing I do not understand about the discussion. That, you know, people have developed a kind of fantasy island housing economics. In the real world, as we've seen over the last 4 years, where housing viability has been smashed after COVID internationally. By the way, of all the G20 countries, guess how many have not delivered their housing targets in the last 5 years? And the answer is 20, right? There's an international housing crisis going on. And the discussion in Australia is too introspective about if only we built 3 or 4% extra, everything would be okay. It's bigger than that. So housing is different. Even if we ramped up dramatically to 4%, it's not going to have much impact on house prices in our capital cities. So that's the dialogue of the deaf, it seems to me. What impact do we think this supply will have on affordability? Not very much. On homelessness? Not very much. On ownership levels amongst young people? Not very much. So my question would be, what answer, if 1.2 million homes is the answer, what's the question?
That's a very good question indeed. What do you think the question should be?
The question should be what we heard earlier on is how do we restore affordability levels to the early 80s? By the way, in Australia in 1980, the proportion of bank finance going to industry was 70% to business. Now it's 70% to residential development, right? So basically we need to say to ourselves, do we want to give people a right to shelter? That's a good one. Yes. Do we want to restore affordability levels to ownership levels, share of ownership levels, young people, poorer people being able to own a home? Yes, we do. So I think those are the kind of questions we want answers to. Do we want housing investment to play the absurdly large role it plays in Australian economic development? when we've got one of the lowest, least complex economies in the universe, but the highest house prices? Do we not think there's a link between the fact that we're not putting enough money into innovation sectors, but we're putting too much money into making people landlords, is what Australian housing policy has been doing. So for me, we're asking the wrong questions.
Rachel ViforJ, are there any examples, and I think of a case study in Auckland, for example, but where are the examples that say that supply, increasing housing supply, increases housing affordability, both domestically and internationally?
Well, Auckland's often been cited as a success story, okay? But it's actually...
What happened in Auckland?
Well, the way that it's been cited, you know, in media and in many reports as well, is that they've had significant upzoning, increased density, especially, you know, in the inner city areas.
So by upzoning, you meant that they rezoned?
Yeah, that's right. To allow
they created a super council, I think, as well, didn't they?
And allow more dwellings, greater density in areas that are close to jobs in the inner city areas, and therefore, by implication, allow greater housing, new housing supply in areas where there's more jobs and more public transport, etc.
So there was a building boom of medium to high density housing.
Yes, that's right. And also, Auckland's been cited as a success story because it's reported that housing became more affordable over there.
So rental prices dropped.
Yes, but I think you have to look at some of the more nuanced complexities, and you know, I don't want to talk about sort of technical issues around how things are measured and all that. I think I would simply put forward the point that every city and every region is different. Whether, you know, when we talk about Auckland, it's very different from Perth. It's very different from Brisbane. Even when we look within Australia, what's happening in Sydney is not necessarily happening in Darwin. So this, I find it, again, it's too simplistic. This idea that something seems to be happening in one city and it seems to be working in terms of affordability, this idea that therefore it would happen here, I think it's highly questionable.
And let's be clear, Auckland is still an extremely unaffordable city for many people.
Well, house prices have started rising again in Auckland, so whatever affordability gains that came out over the last few years are being reversed as we speak. For every Auckland, there's another example of another city where greater housing supply has not led to a reduction in house prices. So, well, there's Ireland in the mid-1990s to the early 2000s, where there was housing supply boom, and they had one of the highest construction rates on a per person basis in all of Europe, and house prices just kept going up. And in fact, house prices, I think, more than doubled between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s, before the bust. You know.
Just, we've got a case study closer at home. I mean, it did annoy me, this thing about Auckland. When people talked about it, they didn't look at Sydney. So Sydney, in the same period that Auckland showed this increase in housing delivery, trebled its housing delivery. Sydney went from 13,000 homes after the crash in 2011 to 40,000 by 2018, and prices went up. By the way, delivery of housing went up during COVID, stupidly and strangely enough, and prices went up. And I don't know if anybody has worked in the private sector like I have, but basically, we put more stock into the market when prices go up, not when they go down. So we're looking in completely the wrong direction. What we're missing is the thing that's missing from all the discussions in England and in Australia, is that, I'll give you an example. In 1975 in England, 40% of all housing was public housing. And when we stopped building public housing in 1975, the private sector response was 0 extra homes. They built exactly the same year in, year out, even though the population increased by 5 million. So for me, the missing discussion about housing is, can Australia go back to being the house building society it was post-war, when 10 to 15% of all homes were public housing, non-market housing? I believe that would have some restraining effect on private sector uplift in housing value, but not the 2% we're producing through the private development line only. I think people don't need to get out more and compare what's happening in Australia to what's happening internationally. Everybody's been going through the same crisis. They are not all governed by the New South Wales planning system. There it is, I said it. So basically, every single country you look at in the G20 has had some problem. The thing that unifies them is cheap money over the last 20 years to keep the world economy afloat, interest rates at a historically low level, and no public housing. That's what unites them. What doesn't unite them is their planning systems. So I wouldn't want anybody here to think there's proof that what stops housing being cheap in Australia is its planning systems. That's displacement activity. That's nonsense.
Well, we'll come to the planning system because it has been identified by many players, including the Productivity Commission in their recent report, as a major factor in limiting supply in Australia and not meeting the Housing Accord targets. Rachel, we were discussing where there has been evidence that increasing supply can actually decrease housing affordability. You also say that we don't pay enough, and you alluded to this earlier, enough to the demand side, but also to developer behaviour. So just articulate that a little further for us. Like, this is vital, isn't it, in this conversation about affordability and increasing supply? Yeah,
I think so. And look, even if we wanted to, in my view, of course, is that, like, new supply is one way, one of many ways of getting towards more affordable housing. So we need to do many things, not just build more houses. But even if we wanted to just focus on building more new houses, we're having problems with that. And a key reason is that the housing production process, the act of starting from, land release, land assembly and all that, all the way to putting a house out onto the market is a pretty complicated process. The whole process is not called planning. The whole process involves planning. It involves, development finance. It involves construction. And we know, for instance, right now, there's, we need a whole lot, many more construction workers if we're going to meet the 1.2 million housing target. I think Master Builders Australia has, they've estimated we need another 130,000 workers in the construction industry if we're going to get there. So there's construction, and there's also developer behavior. And the key aspect of that is that developers are rational profit makers. Okay, we're talking about market housing here. So if we're asking developers to deliver on affordability, I think that's a pretty tough ask, because if they can't make a project feasible, they're not going to build it, because it's not going to generate sufficient return for them to justify doing that. So there are actually...
And in many cases, and increasingly so, I gather, high-density developments, they're just not commercially viable.
That's right. And there's actually many examples of instances where development applications for apartments have been approved many years ago, and construction hasn't actually started. I actually spoke to a colleague from New South Wales recently, and I said, do you have some examples, and he sent me some addresses. So look, go to the New South Wales planning portal, look up 34 Tallawong Road, Tallawong, okay? So back in October 2022, the development application for 914 apartments were approved, and construction has not started there. There's 22 Queen Street, Campbelltown, where the development application for 548 apartments were approved back in August 2023. Construction has not started there.
So there's a lot at work there, though, isn't there? What are some of the variables that are holding back construction? Is it about commercial viability? Is it other things?
That's a big deal, especially when you're talking about apartments. They are expensive to build, much more expensive than houses. And there are many factors at play. Look, taxes affect construction, they affect developers as well, interest rates do as well. So there's all these factors just affecting the delivery of new houses onto the market.
I feel like a great moment and a wave of empathy for developers coming over me, and I need to say something positive about them at this point in time, but also about governments, because you didn't allow me to do that warm thing I said I might want to do, right? So, because in order to earn the right to be critical, I feel like they need to be warm. So I think one thing that listeners and the world need to know, the Australian governments and state governments have been doing some really new stuff. It's great that the feds are back into putting some money into housing, which they haven't been for a while, and some of the state governments have been incredibly innovative, and people in this room have been innovative in trying to do the public-private, not-for-profit innovation around HAF, the new fund that the government has set up, and all that is very, very important. The empathy with the developers is that, if you've got Lend Lease saying, and Lend Lease, still are, I think, world-class kind of people, saying, I think to the market about 9 months ago, that they couldn't do bog standard housing anymore because they couldn't make any money from it. And the reason is not the planning system. It's the viability problem that they have, that they bought land or they optioned it 5 years ago, land prices shot up, cost of borrowing shot up, no access to skills post-COVID, construction materials go up 40%. So a lot of these optioned and approved planning permissions that are out there can't be progressed, not because somebody in Willara is holding up Australia, in the planning department, but because it's not viable. So and the developers can't make something happen from nothing in those circumstances. They've had real objective difficulties. It was one of the strangest things I thought in the announcement 2 years ago, was it, when the federal government said we're going to do 1.2 million. They announced it at the very moment that the world system of housing went into crisis. And it just makes you wonder where they get advice from. By the way, I didn't sound as positive as I meant to be then about...
But look, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, on which Rachel sits, recently gave us the housing system snapshot with the forecasts that the Housing Accord target of 1.2 million houses by 2029 will not be met, and no state or territory is going to meet its targets under the Accord either. So there are some clear barriers, aren't there, David Reynolds?
Oh, there are. It's challenging. And to pick up this point and the warmth for developers, it's probably not my strength either, to be honest. But it is a challenge. Like, we know they're trying to develop properties, and we talk about apartments, and certainly in a South Australia context, same problem. These things are not viable to be able to develop.
Yep.
The only apartments you can probably get away to market are in the city, and they have to be pretty much more than $1 million each in apartments, which is way above the average house price in Adelaide, to be able to get them away to make the project viable. So we're not getting any affordable housing outcomes out of any housing projects for apartments that work. So that is a policy challenge that we need to do more about to make sure we're helping those get developed. But if we go out to greenfield sites, out on the edge of the suburbs, where people are building houses, no problems for developers out there. They can make money and they can continue to build houses in those areas.
And you're prioritising greenfields areas in your state, yes?
We are, because it's the thing that works easiest. So we are, in terms of getting stock up, we absolutely moved to much more prioritising of greenfield sites out in the suburbs and continue to grow, because we know we can get stock. But it is then a challenge between developers, and if you're a developer, your job is to maximise your profits.
Yeah.
So how much supply do you put into the market? And so one of the things we've been talking a lot about is making sure we're getting developers to put more supply in, compete with each other, have a market. And one thing we know, the government owns a range of land out in these areas. So we're putting our own land into the market with actual contracts with these developers, but with timelines on them, to make sure you use it or you lose it.
See, I think
sure we're actually delivering more houses and getting the product in there in a way that will help get the competition into the market.
And are developers responding?
Yeah, absolutely, because they can see, again, they can make money out of this because we've got the land, we'll sell it out there, so they can make profits from building these houses. So they're responding and getting out there, and we're building more houses in these areas, which means we're at least localised. We're getting some respite on the house price growth that's been out in this zone.
It's at this point I want to say that I want to establish the Australian Society for Grateful Developers. I don't think it'll be a great success immediately, but because...
You won't need a big room for that one.
I know, because I think one of the things that does annoy me about this is the governments have been bending over backwards, really, to try and take the horse to water to make it drink, in terms of giving developers what they want around planning reforms and all sorts of innovations and investments and infrastructure and all this kind of stuff. But it's been slow to respond. The private sector's been slow to respond for viability reasons. But it is easier. David makes a very good point, but this is a challenging point to that bit of the federal government statement that he wants to build lots of new homes in well-placed, well-located areas. That's code for...
The ultimate euphemism, I think.
But it's code for, transit-oriented development around public transport in the inner-city areas. These are the most difficult places, actually, to make viability stack up at this point in time. Also, we forget, I do think this is something we all forget internationally, is that it's much more difficult to build a block of flats than it is to build a bunch of separate standalone homes. And part of the slowdown is that we're asking people who have not done lots of housing apartment development before to go into this business, because we haven't got a lot of apartment developers. So that's one thing. But the second thing is a financial thing, which I think is critical, which is one of the reasons I'm very critical of the Grattan report, because I don't think it understands the business model of house builders, which is that they have to satisfy their banks, or apartment builders are particularly exposed, they have to satisfy their banks that they will make a 20% return on capital employed before the banks will lend them money for the next brick, right? That's not like you and I go into business and say, I just want to make 3% more than cost. That's not the model. So if you're ever wondering what makes housing different, is that they don't just deliver for a cost plus a little bit of profit. It has to be a wodge of 20% because it's a risky business. Again, you know, the Society for Helping Developers, I'm empathetic, right? This is very important. But what it means is that if they can't get the pre-sales for the apartments, because the market's a bit tricky, no matter what the need is, no matter how much population growth in Melbourne, you know, those are not going to come forward because they can't get money from the banks because the pre-sales are not there. So government innovation, and you see a bit of this in New South Wales, where they are, you know, I think doing the right thing, the state government, and looking at co-investing to de-risk some of this stuff. So it's not, that is my phone. So that's not just planning. That's public-private collaboration in a more robust way, taking some of the risk away from the private sector, but asking for something in return.
All right, let's
which I think is more affordable housing.
Let's come to David Reynolds, who heads up a government department. How do you see that relationship of government to developers and de-risking?
Oh, absolutely. This is part of the partnership that we need to go going forward. First, I must admit, since I do have a planning system as part of my department, I should defend them slightly from that process. Like, I don't think there are any planners out there deliberately trying to slow down the approval of housing. That's not a reasonable proposition. They're all out there trying to do the right thing, balancing their objectives, trying to get it there. But that doesn't mean, by any stretch, that we can't make planning systems better. It might be the first time ever they put an economist in charge of a planning system. I'm not sure if that was a great idea. But it is something where you go and look at it and say, there are efficiencies we can get there. And we're all now designing much faster pathways through planning systems, things which are called deemed to satisfy, which means if you follow the certain rules, you can get straight planning without even having to get a tick from anyone, and it's automatically approved. And these sorts of processes are being done for a range of, and need to be done for a lot more parts of planning system approvals. So we can do that, and I think planners are out there, they're all very keen for that to happen. So that's my defence of the planning system. In terms of working with developers, yes, this is something which governments need to keep doing. We can't just keep saying, all right, we just need to get more houses built and wait for the private sector to step up and start delivering those houses. It's not going to happen for all the reasons we've outlined. The financials are complex, they have different incentives, they're trying to make profits, that's their job. So
yeah, if you created a planning system nirvana, would the developers come? Not necessarily. Not
necessarily. They do need their profit margins, they do need those things to happen, but it's where the innovation in government comes from. It's where we start talking about what can governments do to make that happen. And it's not just adding supply of our own, it's working with them. How do we underwrite things? How do we make sure that we're making good decisions which make it work? And this is the much more complicated discussion. And we say, well, supply doesn't affect affordability. So the obvious question is, what does? And what does, in my head, is this working together part about how do we take some of this risk away? You know, so when we, part of our Urban Renewal Authority in South Australia, we build our own projects. So we're increasingly doing our own delivery. So we as a government don't have the near 20% profit margins requirement on us, because it's not what we do, which means we can get on and develop things which the private sector wouldn't do. And that's part of what we do, and that's not just for public housing. We do that and then sell them into the market as well. So we can do different things to add to stock as part of that process, but then we need to ask developers, what do you need? Now, they're not very good at telling us that either, to be honest, so we need to actually get better at that conversation with developers, which is something we're working on, trying to get smarter conversations happening.
Rachel ViforJ, let's talk about what we actually build. You know, there's this conversation about supply, but as you said, it depends. We should be talking about the specificity of location, of cities, of you know, different places in Australia have different requirements. The quality of what we're building, is there enough of a conversation about that? How do you think we should get nuanced about what we supply?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we need to get away from the narrative that we have a single housing market in Australia. I think we just need to stop that conversation, because we do not have
What's the problem with that conversation?
Well, the problem with that conversation is that it assumes that if you build one extra house in Perth, that it's going to benefit someone in Sydney, which is just not true. Okay, and it assumes that if you build, 2 extra units in Alice Springs, that it's going to benefit someone in Melbourne, and that's just not true. So I think my perspective is that this idea of, well, as long as we just keep building new houses, that's going to make housing more affordable for everyone. I think it's a flawed argument in my view, and even if that it was true, it would take ages for it to happen, and what you would need to do is to just keep building lots of new houses over a very long period of time while preventing housing demand, which is the number of properties that people want, or preventing that from rising. Now, how do you do that? It's just impossible. So I think you really need to move away from this idea that there is a single housing market in Australia. Recognize the fact that the housing market is very segmented. The apartment sector operates very differently from the separate houses. Sydney operates very differently from Perth, from Brisbane, etc. And that also applies, I think, to the planning argument as well. I think the planning system is actually very localized. Actually, every state's got a different planning system, in my view. And so this idea that somehow we can have some kind of just some national measure that's going to change and improve planning for every single jurisdiction it's a huge
So you're
ask.
making things more complicated.
Well, I mean,
How dare you?
things are more complicated. It's probably easier to just go out there and say, let's just build our way out of this crisis. But I just don't think that it will get us to affordability, which is what we're looking for. I think affordability means, not just building in the right places.
Affordability and equity of access, yeah?
That's right.
Is that what we're looking for?
Well, we're looking for affordability. We're looking, and linked to that is intergenerational equity, and also intra-generational equity as well. I mean, I cannot buy the argument that if you build a new house in, I don't know, Peppermint Grove, that's a really wealthy area in Perth, that's somehow going to benefit a single older woman who's on the verge of homelessness.
So what needs to change? In what ways do we need to get more specific, more fine-grained in this conversation about supply? I mean, and even now we haven't talked about, well, what sort of housing are we talking about here? And what sorts of needs are being met through that housing?
That's right, and that's another complication, I might dare add, because yes, we've been talking about density as a way of increasing new supply, but not all high-density housing is affordable. Some high-density housing is very expensive. So that's an issue. We also need to consider what young families aspire to, and not everyone wants to live in an apartment, and that's just a fact, that not everyone wants to raise a family in a small apartment. And those are things that we need to consider, which is, what are people's aspirations? What do they want for their families? We don't talk enough about that. I would also like to mention that, like going back to this example of if you build one new home in Peppermint Grove, that's just not going to affect someone on the verge of homelessness. Well, it does mean that, in my view, a targeted approach towards, seriously increasing non-market housing, what I mean is social and affordable housing, I think would be one effective way of trying to address the more acute need that's at the lower end of the income and wealth distribution, which is amongst people who are living in poverty. So I think we need to do that. We have 170,000 households on a public housing wait list, and the social housing stock has grown at 1/3 the rate of population growth in all of Australia over the last 10 years. So what are we talking about
And
here?
this is off a base of being wound back to a significant
that's
degree.
Right. So that's an area where we could obviously be more targeted in terms of, and I know that the Housing Australia Future Fund is trying to get us there. It's had a rocky start, but it's on its way, hopefully. But what we desperately need right now is, I think, a social housing target. Just looking at not just an overall 1.2 million well-located housing for anybody in the income distribution, but okay, that's great, 1.2 million overall target's great. But how about having a target within a target? How about having a social housing target? How about looking at the need amongst those who are in poverty and dealing directly with that?
Tim Williams, social housing is a big part of what you would like to see focused on in this conversation about supply.
Because I grew up in public housing, which we didn't call public housing, we called council housing, words matter. And it's funny, I've never been as warm about the term social housing because it always feels like charitable giving, whereas public housing feels like a right, you know. And I think that I agree completely that we need a target to go back to a proportion of every year we're going to do 10% non-market housing in every city in Australia until we get back to 15% of all stock, because I think that was a healthy position to be in. By the way, I forgot my rule. My rule was that I wanted to be warm about something in order to win the right to be critical. Is that okay with you? I'll carry on with that rule.
So you can let it rip now.
Well, I am. I'm going to be warm about South Australia because the entire state, because it's always been quite innovative, because it's quite challenging environment sometimes. So it's always been very innovative. And I think the idea that there should be more robust public-private partnering is very important. But also, the bit I'm going to be quite critical about, although I take my life in my hands about this, is in the government statements, federal government statements around we want well-located, homes. Implicit in that is a good discussion about that. High-density living gets you a better environment. Healthy, wealthy, and wise, communities live closer to public transport, walkable, with canopy cover, and it's all that kind of stuff. But the problem, which I think in South Australian discussion, I think they instinctively know all about, is that people to own a home is relatively easier in a suburban context. Urbanists don't like suburbia. Even in Australia, urbanists don't like, even though the reality we live with is a huge proportion of our society lives in suburbs, right? So I think there's still a bit of a discussion that's unresolved for me. You talk about type of housing, quality of housing, location of housing is an issue, because although I suppose where I'm going is I think we have to accept that it is easier to build in suburbia, and it's probably cheaper to own in suburbia, but we would like suburbia not quite as it is at the moment, for it to be much more of I call it superbia, by the way, which is a kind of higher density, better connected, walkable kind of version of it. I must say, by the way, if anybody's been around some places in Western Australia, I went down towards the Margaret River. There's some really good, well-planned, new development that's got a mix of uses, looks like a proper town centre. All I'm saying is, I think in the discussion about what type of housing, definitely more public, and definitely more shared equity, by the way. I think it's we need to grow shared equity massively, I think. But I also think about the location discussion. We might have to be less earnest about our urbanist obsessions and maybe think about how we make the suburbs flourish again.
David Reynolds from South Australia.
Can I just pick up on that point? And you're talking about new suburbs, what people build and what the product looks like. And we have this conversation with developers who want to build the houses out there and say, can we put more density into these new suburbs, put some apartments, put that in there? And the answer we tend to get from developers is nobody wants to buy it. Nobody wants it. Now, the thing we sell is 3-bedroom houses, and that's what we want to keep doing. I, to be honest, have never been convinced by this argument. I think that's what people think they want, because that's the only thing we're offering them. I'm actually not sure we're actually giving them the choice. They say, well, that's all they want. Well, that's the only choice they've got. It's like going to a restaurant, there being one thing on the menu and wondering why everybody orders it. It's absolutely what we keep doing. So we've been talking to them about, okay, how can we make this innovation change? And where we've got government land out there that we can do different things on, we're going to build some different product to try and market lead to prove that this product is saleable. So we're building some smaller dwellings for different types of people, and there'll be a cheaper price point that people can actually then get there to do it. Because we have an affordable housing policy, inclusionary zoning is the technical term, which means for all these new developments, 15% of them have to be at an affordable price point. But we can do more than that with our own properties and our own land that goes out there and provide different type of product, which I think is the job of government here. Innovative, market-leading, different things.
Sorry, I want to be hugely warm again, but
I'm just scared.
I know, it's scary. South Australia.
He's really going to land a big whopper soon.
By the way, I've got a great face for radio. I've been wanting to say that all program. But I think that the left to itself, weirdly, we always think of the private sector as being intrinsically innovative. In housing, it's not been. Right? It's particularly housing at scale, not the standalone rich person's house where like a star architect can do something interesting and all that stuff. Bog standard housing, it's not been very innovative. What's been innovative is the public sector in housing has been more innovative historically. There's an exhibition that Uhuri, a fine organisation for your listeners to understand, have just put up a great exhibition about innovation in public housing. Because actually, if you're a developer, and it's really kind of a risky business, and nobody in the chain wants you to be innovative because that's going to lead to disaster, perhaps the public sector role could be, and is, by the way, historically, to de-risk some of the innovation, right? Around, for example, energy efficiency is a good example where, the governments might have done housing which shows the private sector how to do that so that they don't have to be first to do it, somebody else has done it for us. And the stuff around public-private collaboration, the inclusionary zoning thing must not be, again, your listeners, the inclusionary zoning is requiring a mandatory amount of housing that the private sector should provide, perhaps with the government or through a community housing provider. We hear scare stories across Australia that this will destroy the viability of private sector development. That is completely untrue. And the reason why it works in every other part of the universe is we tell the developers before they buy the land that they're going to be doing 10 or 15% for submarket. And in those terms, it's not unaffordable.
I think
we must kill that myth now.
I think it's an important point that you make, that innovation happens in the public sector. I think we often forget that conversation, that somehow there's this assumption, almost a stereotype, almost a stigma, that innovation only happens in the private sector, and that's just simply not true. Fact doesn't play that out. David Reynolds, I was interested in a press club address given by Danielle Woods, the Productivity Commissioner, where she talked about increasing the productivity of the construction industry in Australia and listing all the various ways in which it isn't, historically and to this present day. And she talked about the sorts of tough choices that we might have to make, people in your role have to make, in order to get things cracking and meet targets of supply. Things like pitting heritage and density restrictions up against enabling more and cheaper houses, or pitting government procurement rules and prioritising local jobs and small businesses up against reducing increasing the opportunities for lower cost infrastructure provision, but also increasing the requirements for energy efficiency in the construction code versus making it faster, cheaper to provide housing. Do you prioritise future energy savings? So are you wrestling with some of those compromises? Do you see, I was sort of surprised that she set them up as binaries, and I wonder whether you can get it right the first time. Are these false binaries that she's setting up at this stage of the 21st century, when we should be prioritising energy efficiency in housing developments?
No, I think they're very real binaries, and they are things which we struggle with every day, trying to get these balances right. What you just described is the job of government in many ways. There are many competing priorities, many competing objectives. And we'd love to achieve valuing heritage, making sure we've got energy efficiency, getting the density right, doing all these things simultaneously. But that's very hard to try and get all these things because they do work against each other. Changes to the National Construction Code to increase energy efficiency rules increase the cost of building a house, which works against an affordability objective. We know this happens, so we do every day make these decisions about what the policy settings should be. And you will have seen,
part of the innovation in this sector also working out ways to create energy efficient developments at scale in an affordable way?
Absolutely. But how long does this take is the question I always ask.
But isn't it a vital situation that we face right now,
yes,
to improve energy efficiency?
Absolutely, and it will continue to be so.
Or do we want to put people in tiny hot boxes in mass developments?
No, we don't want to do that, but we equally need to put them in houses. So this is the challenge
always.
What
do you mean by a house?
How do we make this trade-off every single day and what we try and do? And you try and get this balance right. It's no point leaving them in their car because you can't put them in their house either. You need to try and get this balance right of all these things, which is always the challenge. The South Australian government already moved to say we won't make any further changes to National Construction Code, and then the federal government has made that same commitment. Any substantial changes outside safety issues, because it increases the cost of building houses. So again, we're trading these things off to say what is the right objectives. In a perfect world, we live in a great utopian world, we get all of these things right today. And to your question was, well, aren't we in 2025? So surely we've been doing this a long time and we're all sophisticated enough to be able to achieve every policy objective at the same time. The truth is we're not there, but I don't think we can stop and say, well, let's just wait until we get all those things right before we press ahead. You know, we are in a housing crisis. We need to keep acting like we're doing things here. And to make some progress, yes, you have to accept some of these trade-offs, which is the challenging job, and that's why we have politicians and they get elected for making these trade-offs. And our job as public servants is to give them those choices and to try and see which ones are the least risky to be able to get on and do it. You talk about government procurement rules, another thing which we need to continue to refine to make sure we do those as efficiently as humanly possible to make sure we get all of those objectives right. To the broader question about productivity, there's a lot of questions about productivity in the construction sector, and it is hard, and Danielle's right, there are real challenges in this. It has had the slowest productivity growth of many sectors, as is well reported. To me, I think that comes largely from the fact that the construction industry is made up of a lot of really small businesses, tradies, a lot of small 1- and 2-person businesses. And what we know is that's not where you get productivity growth from. The way you get innovation in business is from larger companies, not from small business, which is really a struggle in this sector again.
I think you get some pushback from some small businesses, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's not how that works. Go and look at the data, it'll show you that that's where it is. Yeah, small businesses do amazing things, but equally they're busy trying to do the accounts at night and trying to get their businesses running. They don't have big R&D sections and big ways to do innovative solutions. That's where you rely on big business. And big business is not part of the construction sector. So it's a real challenging issue. In Australia. So it's a real challenging issue for them to keep doing it. But it will come. We know that they will change the way we build houses. And again, government's doing a whole range of things as we're trying to encourage some of that activity along that path. Because again, I always think of us as we're the innovation bit of this. How do we do things first, prove it can be done, get it down the cost curve, make it more efficient, and then make it viable for business to pick up.
I'd like to come to audience questions now. So we've got roving mics. The people in the red T-shirts, the keeper of the mics will come to you, and we'd love your questions. Please don't be shy, and then we can all go and have a drink. And I know you're probably hanging for a cup of tea or a drink shortly. Just if you could keep them with a question mark, that'd be great. Not a big ramble. Keep them pretty focused because I want to get through as many as I can. So where are we? We've got one there. Thank you. Go for it. And feel free to introduce yourself if you so choose.
Hi, I'm Alex Meek from Department of Housing and Works here in Perth. Rachel touched on this a little bit in her intro, but then we didn't really go back there.
Just bring the mic really right close up.
Rachel touched on this a little bit in her intro, but then we didn't really go back to it. I'm just thinking about the other financial incentives we could have to improve the 98%. So you mentioned removing stamp duty, maybe swapping out stamp duty for higher land tax, changing retirement and those sort of financial incentives that we could change to increase fluidity in the housing market. Any comments on that?
Rachel?
So I think there are, obviously, I talked about winding back stamp duty and, and that would have to be replaced with a broad-based land tax. That is one major way. You can do this through planning changes as well. I mean, currently, I think there are already planning changes that have already been made that have allowed for greater ways of modifying dwellings, for instance, to allow more occupants to stay in there. I think in South Australia, there's been the co-location where you can actually have, say, 2 different families living in there, and you just kind of find ways for people to be able to occupy the same dwelling while being able to, I think, protect their privacy. I think that's what matters. There's also options, although I'm, less, I suppose, convinced that this might work, but there's been conversations, I think, around perhaps reducing the capital gains tax that might be applicable to people who have spare bedrooms in their houses and who might want to then rent out a bedroom to someone who's looking for a room to rent in. You could potentially look at, for instance, if you have, say, an age pensioner, for instance, who's living in a house with some spare bedrooms, you could potentially look at things like not counting all of the extra rental income in calculating their age pension entitlements, if they were to rent out a bedroom to someone, because once you rent out a room, you basically earn extra income, and that can reduce your age pension. So there are ways of doing this, I think, across numerous measures. It's just that we don't pay enough attention to it because, well, we're very focused on the 2% at the moment.
Is there any policy interest in any of those offerings that you suggest?
Well, I think there's a lot of policy interest from economists and academics about winding back stamp duty and replacing it with a land tax, but I understand that politically it's difficult because stamp duty, in my view, and David, you can feel free to jump in at any time, but in my view, I think stamp duty is a major source of revenue for the state government. It's pretty difficult to tell the state government, hey, just get rid of stamp duty. I think you need the federal government to come in and assist in a transitional arrangement over a long period. The other issue, of course, is that you've got many homeowners who've already paid stamp duty. So you don't want to tell them now, we're getting rid of stamp duty, you've paid it, that's too bad, let's just get rid of it now, but then now you have to pay land tax, which is kind of like a double whammy for those who've already paid stamp duty. So then you've got to look at transitional arrangements where someone who's already paid stamp duty would not have to, pay the land tax until they buy their next house. So I think it's a long process. I think that the conversation around stamp duty and land tax, we've never really had that serious conversation. I think it's always been waved away as, it's just too difficult politically. But I think there are actually ways of doing it with cooperation across different tiers of government, and if there's willingness to do it in a transitional way over a large number of years.
Let's come to another question. Where have we? I can't quite see you. There you are. Yep, great. Where are we? Have we got another question? Yes, there's lots of hands going up. So do you want me to point to people, or what would you like me to do? Point to people? There's a hand over there. There's a hand there. Yep, great. Go for it.
Thanks. Chris Martin from UNSW. I wonder if the panel could discuss another aspect of the developer's dilemma, and that is they might be able to develop a site profitably now, but that also means losing the opportunity to develop it even more profitably later because the site's built out and it's sold off and it's gone now. So what can we do about that dilemma that they face?
Isn't that capitalism? Isn't that the risk that they take? I do feel like setting up the Society for Grateful Developers, by the way. I think it's such a great idea. I don't know that happens. Does that happen very much? I mean, the thing that's happening in New South Wales feels like it's very important to understand.
It happens. It's speculation.
Sorry, I was being flippant, but I'll come back to it because I think I'll come back to it via what the rezoning is doing.
Keep it brief.
Yeah. So, you see, I'm a Welshman. So the rezoning in New South Wales, I think in Australia, governments attempted to do lots of rezoning to upzoning, as they say, to give an opportunity for landowners to build more than they would have before upzoning, and it's having some perverse consequences of people doing less development. Because why bother? They've just increased the value of my land dramatically just by doing nothing. Yeah. But also, some actual existing applications stopped and this happened in Sydney a lot. For about a year, because people said, "Well, I'm not going to go forward with my existing proposition because actually I can get twice the density now, but I have to go back into planning, back into redesigning and all that stuff." So we slowed down delivery. I'm a great believer in the law of unintended consequences, by the way, and one that I think comes back to the earlier question about existing homes is dual occupancy. Dual occupancy in Sydney has led to the bizarre consequence of both units being more expensive than the original one before. So this is not affordable housing in any way, but we did it with the best intentions of creating, more diverse, dense cities. So all change is complicated, but B, we still have to do it.
We've got another question here. Great, thanks. Lots of hands up.
Hi, Matthew Crosley from National Affordable Housing. When we talk about affordability, is the goal to decrease or drive down house prices and risk people having negative equity as a consequence, or is it a longer term strategy to minimise growth and hope that wage growth catches up or
It's
closes in, I guess?
Good question, thank you. Rachel.
Yeah, well, look, I've thought about that question as well, and I played around with two scenarios in my mind. I think one scenario is house prices keep rising. Currently, I think the house is being treated, it's not just shelter, it's pretty much a very lucrative investment for many people. Now, and then I think government policies kind of support that notion, even though government do not say it. At the federal level, there are tax concessions for holding properties and things like that. So if we want to say, all right, let's just go down this path, housing is too late now to turn back the clock, housing's a huge investment for lots of people, so house prices are just going to keep rising relative to incomes. If that's the case, then we have to accept the fact that inequality is going to increase, and therefore there will be greater need for public investment in social and affordable housing.
And the flow-on consequences of inequality in housing is massive. It has massive implications for employment, for health, for mental health, for
That's right.
all sorts of things.
And so I think there's greater onus, on government to basically make sure that social and affordable housing becomes essential infrastructure that's spread across the entire nation for what will be growing numbers of people who will be unable to purchase a property because house prices keep rising. So that's one scenario. The other option, of course, is to say, look, it's a bit late in the day, but let's wind back the clock a little bit and just go back to the fundamentals that what kind of society do we want? If we want a society where lots and lots of people are able to own their own home because of all the security and all the benefits that come with it, then we have to make housing less attractive as an investment. I mean, that's a difficult conversation. And that does mean, a scenario where we see the house price to income ratio moderate, flatten, and dare I say it, even fall over time. But I don't really see any other way around it.
And is that to also address the elephant in the room, which is tax reform?
I would say.
Well, yes, it is, because, we
Capital gains tax discount, negative gearing.
Yeah, that's right. And again, the moment we start having this conversation, I think a key argument that lots of people would bring up, and there is some merit to it, which is that, we don't want investors to flee the market and therefore reduce the supply of rental housing. I think that's what a lot of people would say. Well, my response to that would be, well, okay, we've got 2.2 million Australians who are rental investors. 30% of these rental investors own more than one investment property. So can we wind back tax concessions on the second, maybe the third property? Can we just make a start? We don't have to kind of throw the wrecking ball, at the tax regime, but we could embark on, again, some kind of method, some kind of arrangement where we actually start winding back tax concessions, maybe for the third property. Maybe
David Reynolds?
So I just want to go back to the question. The other way I think about this, instead of having to worry about reducing house prices across the board, gets back to the conversation we did have, which is what are we building? So I think part of that question is, instead of us thinking about the totality of house prices and everybody out there worrying about, we're just trying to drop everyone's house prices, let's go back to think, what can we build that is smaller, cheaper, a different product that is out there, and focus on affordability in that market segment rather than thinking it as one complete group.
But doesn't that then increase a disparity of haves and have-nots? And by that I also mean the haves who get the fancy houses and the have-nots who get what's available.
No, I think
what's at the end of a long queue every time you turn up to rent a property these days in capital cities. It's a torturous experience. You're at the end of a long queue of 100 people, and what's at the other end of that queue is often an absolute tragedy of an offering.
Yeah, I don't see it that way. I think what we're doing is creating a mid-market point which doesn't exist at the moment. It's like, where do you go first? And then how do you build into the housing market by taking your first property and then selling that and moving up later? It's something we don't think about enough at the moment. So I think that position in the property market, as we know, above public housing but below market housing, there's this gap where people just can't get in. They're the people in the queue that you're referring to. What can we offer to them that's actually something that's a different product? And that's where I think the deeper conversation should go.
I think we make a lot of assumptions about who's standing in that queue these days. A whole lot of different people are standing in that queue with a whole lot of different incomes.
I do think that when they invented negative gearing back at the end of the 30s in Australia, actually, it was a pretty good idea of trying to incentivize people to develop flats. And it made some sense. We didn't expect to end up with 20% of the Australian house owning class owning more than one property, that they become landlords. I don't think we saw that coming. The answer to the question, I think, is it's a really fundamental question about, what do we mean by affordability, and what are the ways in which we're going to achieve it. I don't think, that's why when I started, I said I thought the government was being slightly performative about its 1.2 million homes as having some effect on housing affordability, because they don't want it to have some effect on housing affordability because of the political problem. So my answer is, it took 25, 30, 40 years to get into this mess. It's going to take 20 years to get out of it. But we do need to do the things we've heard about in the platform. On the one hand, build more non-market housing outside the system that could have some long-term dampening effect and provide shelter. At the same time, incentivize the rest of us not to overinvest in residential and landlordship, but into the innovation economy. And I think therefore reforms of negative gearing, reforms of capital gains and super are all required. But where's the political bravery to do it, I think, is the...
But also one might ask, do the demographics of the political class need to change? When you look at the ledger of who has how many housing investments in government at the moment, it's pretty extraordinary, the stats. Another question, thank you. Where are we next? Yep. I'm sorry, I want to get over there too. So yes, there's a hand there, a hand there. That hand's been up for a while. Goodo. Yep.
I'll be quick. Rob Stokes from Faith Housing Australia. Given Rachel's observation that supply is such a sort of a vague concept to be a bit nebulous, and considering and assuming that we can't change the tax system, we can't change the planning system, and building costs are what they are, what does the panel think would be the best type and tenure of housing that we could do now to best deal with the supply challenge we have? What type and tenure of housing is most important where we are right now?
And keep the answers really tight. David, do you have a thought on that?
I'm kind of where I was a minute ago on that, which is, smaller dwellings are clearly part of this thing. And as to tenure, I'm not as fussed, but there are, new products which we talk about. We talk about rent-to-buy products. We talk about these things which we need to work into the market, so subsidised rent to start with, and then moving into buying the property. So these kind of new products which haven't existed for a very long time in this country. We go back, government used to build a lot of houses to sell as well as just to use for public housing. So I think that sort of product is the thing that I think about.
I'm going to grab two questions in a row. So we've got one there and we've got one there. So I'll come to the gentleman there. The mic's on, just go for it.
Mike Allen from Link Wentworth Community Housing in New South Wales. Thank you for a fascinating and really thought-provoking conversation. I've been involved in the social and affordable housing sector for more than 40 years, and it is the worst set of circumstances that I've ever seen. So this is a real crisis. We've talked about the panel have talked about some of the more immediate interventions, but this crisis is also an opportunity. How do we use this opportunity to create some longer term, more sustainable change, so hopefully we don't finish up in this situation again? And something like, heaven forbid, we might have a national housing strategy.
I'll just push the question back to you, if I can. What's at the top of your list?
Top of my list at the moment, frankly, is a national housing strategy. I'm too old to not want to have something happen that will make more sustainable, long-lasting change, and a national focus through a strategy like some of our comparable countries, like Canada and others, that will help prevent us getting in this situation again. Because, as Michael Fotheringham said this morning, and I was here 10 years ago, we were sitting in this room trying to work out ways to get political attention. We've got political attention. We absolutely, desperately have to use it because it will fade away.
Thank you. I'll come to that question in a tick, but yes, quick response.
No, it's just that I think Mike's right. But I think this discussion and this going out on the ABC is an important part of having a slightly different civic conversation at this point. The best answer is not just more of the same, even though the last 2 years has seen some really good stuff. It's a moment to say, come on then, what are we really trying to do with this housing intervention? Who for? What objectives do we want for our young people? What objectives do we want for people from Aboriginal communities? Well, to actually have the outcomes that we want from public policy and then work backwards to the methods required to achieve it, I think.
Well, Aboriginal communities would say, not your objectives, our objectives.
But it's in the strategy.
Self-defined.
It's in the strategy, yeah.
Rachel, did you want to pick up on anything?
Yeah, I'd be really in favour of a national housing strategy as long as it's a national housing affordability strategy and not a national housing supply strategy. And I think, therefore, that needs to include, the strategy needs to cover things that like tax, it needs to cover things like population planning, proper migration forecasting, so that we actually know how many houses we need as the population grows. I mean, these are things, they are all related to housing, and that, I think, it would have to be a broad-based national housing affordability strategy.
We've got a question here. Thank you.
Hello, Ashley Ismail from the Young Women's Council of Australia. There
Just bring your mic right up to your face, yeah, and reintroduce yourself, thanks.
Ashley Ismail from the Young Women's Council of Australia. There used to be a lot of media attention on the impact that Airbnbs were having on affordability. I haven't heard anything mentioned today about that so far. Where's that at the moment, and what are your opinions on that?
I'll come to Rachel on that, because that's an interesting example of existing stock
I love that.
not being available in a sustainable way.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's actually many studies that have been done, worldwide, which has shown that as the Airbnb sector has expanded, that has actually increased rents across the board, and I think that would apply as well in some of our big cities. So, you can look at the total housing stock in Australia and say, look, you can divide them into the primary housing stock, which is like the houses you live in, the houses you own, that you live in for your own purposes. And then there's a secondary housing stock, which the owner doesn't actually live in it. And that sector has actually grown significantly. And it's actually between 2006 and 2022, what I call the secondary housing sector has actually grown by about 41% compared to 24% amongst the primary housing sector. So there's actually been a massive growth, I think, in the secondary dwelling stock, which does include lots of properties that are being let out on a short-term basis at the expense of long-term rental affordability.
Okay, so we're going to do a bit of a speed date of questions now, because we've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to take questions in a row. I'll scribble down if you forget them. Go for it. We've got one there, and we may have time for one there. Thank you.
Hi, Rebecca McDonald from Firm Foundations. I'm an impact developer, so if I can speak for the developers that aren't in the room. I think what you missed before, you really dismissed planning, and planning is definitely not a silver bullet, but you dismissed the middle of planning, where planning can have a huge impact. And you even dismissed it again, Tim, I'm sorry, I'm going to call you out, where you pulled out the New South Wales example, which I think is actually, for anyone from New South Wales planning in the room, it is the gold standard for what is happening. Yes, it had a short-term impact on development applications being pulled or held, but I think you'll see, my guess, and based on the number of applications I know that are happening at the moment, it's going to have an incredible impact, and other states should be looking at it as something to replicate. South Australia, Queensland, if anyone's from Queensland in the room. Particularly that middle and density housing. You also called out duplexes, and you said it's more expensive than one house, but it now houses two families where it only housed one family before. Yeah. So I think from an economics perspective and an affordability perspective, you're looking at it from one angle, and we're looking at it from how many people can we house as fast as possible, because ultimately everybody in this room is here to reduce suffering. They're to reduce that number of people that are waiting in the line or who are living in their cars, and we desperately just want to create more housing. So anything planning can do to improve that, and from a development perspective, we just want the risk reduced. Giving us certainty, which is what the New South Wales planning scheme has done, we're almost certain that I can turn a one individual family house into 6 new front doors if it's located within 800 metres of a transit station. That is incredible certainty from a development perspective, and you will see thousands of developers run at it with that certainty, and I hope it's rolled out across the region.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to do a
Don't
Tony
dismiss
Jones
it.
and say, take that as a comment. And it was an important comment, so thank you. I'm glad that we got some pushback for our panel. I'm going to take another question over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Angela Cartwright from Better Renting. I think we've established that supply is not the silver bullet. So my question for you is, what is the one thing that we can't fix the crisis in affordable, stable and healthy housing in this country without? And I'm going to put at the top of the list a phased-in scrapping of investor housing tax concessions. I don't see how we fix the crisis in rental housing without addressing that. What do you think?
And I think we're going to make that our final question. Sorry, Sarah, I know you had a question, but take it up in the break. A final comment from you all with that great last question, I think. Thank you. David.
So top of my list on this, and actually before I do that, I am going to address that other thing. Every independent assessment has the South Australian planning system as the best in the country. I just couldn't resist saying that out loud. That's what I'm here for, right? We're the only one with a statewide system, which makes it a whole lot easier, so I just couldn't resist that, sorry. What's on top of my list to make affordability? I think the question for affordability to me is, so I'm less interested in the tax thing, that's not on my list. It's absolutely the product. I've said it a few times up here. What are we building, when and how do we do it? And innovation from government helping to lead that result.
Rachel.
Tax is absolutely on my list. Yeah, stamp duty reform, replace it with a land tax, winding back tax concessions for multi-property owners. So I think.
And it's very interesting reading Alan Kohler's quarterly essay about the history of those policies and tax reform in Australia and what that did to house prices. It's an extraordinary read. Tim.
So we need to help the private sector maximise its delivery, definitely, but we need new other models in the market that are not as reliant as them on homes for sale. So that means the public sector directly developing in a way we used to 40 years ago.
So that question was actually going to be my last question, so that worked a treat, and we're at time. I want you to give it up for Professor Rachel ViforJ, David Reynolds and Dr. Tim Williams. Thank you all. Thanks so much for your fantastic questions, and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks to the conference team for having us. Now, if you'd like to gather outside in the refreshment area, it is your opening night. Enjoy your evening and enjoy getting to know each other throughout the conference. Goodbye. And this was recorded for Big Ideas on ABC Radio National. We'll roll it out sometime later in the year. You can find Big Ideas on the ABC Listen app. Thank you again.